The most famous flight in history, the plane that simply vanished. 239 people boarded, among them at least one. He had a plan, and it wasn't just any plan, but one as ambitious as it was disturbing. To make the plane disappear forever. But this is not at all simple. Commercial planes appear on the screens of air traffic controllers. In addition, radars track them in the sky, and they are connected by satellite. Breaking each and every one of these connections is not at all simple. Everything you're going to see in this video is meant to understand what really happened that day. The smallest details, which at first glance may seem irrelevant, will serve to answer the most important questions. Why are we so sure that one of those 239 people took control of the plane to make it disappear? Why was the search for the plane focused on this region, even though the aircraft disappeared from the map here? And why this case has become one of the biggest enigmas that aviation has ever faced. It was a normal Saturday night in Kuala Lumpur. A Boeing 777-200 was about to make a routine flight to Beijing, with 227 passengers on board, 10 cabin crew, and 2 pilots. The planned route was the usual one, being one of 2 daily flights from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. The departure time was scheduled for 12:35 in the morning local time. That is, it would be a night flight, and the estimated time would be 5 hours and 34 minutes. So they should arrive at the destination at 6:30 in the morning, local time in Beijing. Something vital is that the aircraft loaded enough fuel to fly for 7 hours and 31 minutes. This was normal for that day's route, taking into account the extra fuel. The commander was a man named Zahari bin Hamza, 53 years old, happily married with 3 children. He had been with Malaysia Airlines since 1981. He was an extremely experienced commander with 18,423 flight hours in total, of which 8,659 had been on Boeing, the model of the plane that day. In addition, Zahari had a YouTube channel that is still open to the public today, where he shared practical tricks to do at home. The co-pilot, Farid Abdul Hamid, was also a 27-year-old single Malaysian man with no children who worked for the airline since 2007. At that time, he had 2,813 flight hours. It's important for you to know that of the 2 pilots in a plane, the one with the most responsibility is always the commander, who sits on the left. But that doesn't mean he's the one flying the plane. There's a term known as pilot flying, which refers to the one who will actually be flying the plane. The other will do the job of pilot monitoring, meaning one of them is the one who flies the plane and the other is the one who does the other tasks. They usually alternate roles between flights, allowing each to practice both. However, if an unexpected event occurs, the commander remains ultimately responsible and can take control of the plane at any time. On this flight, the co-pilot would be the one flying the plane as the pilot flying, and the commander would act as the pilot monitoring, so he would mainly be in charge of communications. Once all the flight preparations were made and the passengers were seated, the plane was given permission to start moving and then take off. Finally, it did so 7 minutes late compared to the initial schedule. The aircraft began a standard ascent process towards a Zahari point, one of the points over which Varus would pass. To organize air traffic, there are thousands of points scattered around the world, known as waypoints. Thus, there are references everywhere, and a controller can tell a pilot to head towards a certain point, and both will know exactly which point they are talking about. As the plane reached the Zahari point, a series of communications occurred between the control tower and the commander. This is expected, as the commander was doing the pilot monitoring work. The topic of communications is rather complex, but we'll simplify it slightly to grasp this story. The airspace in that region is split between Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Singapore, and Ho Chi Minh airspaces. Each of these cities has a control tower that is responsible for directing the air traffic that enters their airspaces. Each of these areas is called Flight Information Region, short for Flight Information Region. In this case, it's important for you to know that this area of Singapore's airspace is delegated to Kuala Lumpur's Flight Information Region. In other words, it's as if it belongs to Kuala Lumpur. So, MH370 should leave Kuala Lumpur's Flight Information Region and then enter Ho Chi Minh's Flight Information Region. In fact, this route consisted of reaching the Zahari waypoint, where the plane would turn slightly to the right until it reached the Bateau point. And it's exactly at that moment when the mystery begins. At 12:50 in the morning, air traffic requests MH370 to ascend to 35,000 feet altitude. 11 minutes later, at that altitude, the plane confirmed it over the radio. 6 minutes later, the commander confirms over the radio that he is maintaining altitude. After 12 minutes, Kuala Lumpur air traffic notifies MH370 about transitioning to Ho Chi Minh's control, and they remind them at what frequency they will be able to contact them, to which the commander responds 4 seconds later, wishing them good night.
Malaysian Flight 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9, good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
And that was the last time the plane was heard from on the radio. When the plane passed the point, Zahari began to turn towards Bateau, but 5 seconds later, the plane disappeared. At that instant, air traffic controllers were unaware, since they were in the transition zone from Kuala Lumpur airspace to Ho Chi Minh's. Kuala Lumpur air traffic controllers were not meant to receive updates from the flight after it left their airspace. And the Ho Chi Minh air traffic controllers should be contacted by the plane, so they were simply waiting. And it wasn't until 18 minutes after the aircraft disappeared that the Ho Chi Minh air traffic controllers contacted those in Kuala Lumpur, asking about the plane, telling them they had not yet been contacted, and if they knew anything, perhaps the aircraft had an emergency and simply turned back to land. But those in Kuala Lumpur told them no, that MH370 said goodbye over the radio, and they heard nothing more. 2 minutes later, Kuala Lumpur controllers attempted contacting the aircraft unsuccessfully. The next thing they did was to contact the airline, Malaysia Airlines, to see if they knew where their aircraft was. The airline said yes, that they saw it on their maps, and that it was flying over Cambodia. Something a bit strange, since at no time should the aircraft be flying over that territory. At that moment, they started contacting air traffic controllers near Cambodia, in case any located the aircraft. None of them were able to do so, but Malaysia Airlines said they continued to see the aircraft on their map over Cambodia. The confusion at that moment was enormous, as you can imagine. 1 hour and 9 minutes after the plane disappeared, Malaysia Airlines contacted Kuala Lumpur air traffic to tell them that the information they had previously given that the plane was flying over Cambodia was wrong. The problem was that their software was representing the plane on the map based on the last speed and position report, and was making a time estimate. So no, the plane had not been flying over Cambodia. As the hours passed, it reached 6:30 in the morning in Beijing, the estimated landing time. The airport controllers were hoping that somehow MH370 would contact them for the approach, but that never happened. It was then that the procedures for searching for aircraft debris were activated. The plane's sudden disappearance from air traffic suggested an onboard explosion or a similar catastrophic event. So everything indicated that the plane would have crashed in the area where it had more or less disappeared from the map. While the wreckage was being searched for, every single passenger began to be investigated to see if any of them could have brought a bomb on board, since the most plausible theory then was an explosion. Of the passengers, 153 were of Chinese nationality, 38 were from Malaysia, and the remaining 36 were of other nationalities. Among all of them, 2 in particular drew a lot of attention, these 2 Iranians, because they were traveling with a stolen passport, that is, with a false identity. It was later determined that they were refugees and ruled out as being involved in the incident. Finally, any other passenger was also ruled out. Over the course of months or even years, all possible information began to be analyzed and very strange things were seen. You see, normally we tend to say that a radar works because there is a transmitter that emits a wave and upon receiving an echo back. Does that mean there has been something in between that has bounced that wave back? This signal moves at the speed of light, so knowing how long it took to wrap that wave, we will be able to know the position of that object. And this is correct, but this is how a primary radar works. With commercial aircraft, secondary radars are also used. This is because primary radars allow you to detect an aircraft even if you don't want to be detected. But commercial aircraft want everyone to know where they are, and that's why they use a transponder. This system is a kind of antenna that emits the position, speed, and other parameters when it receives a signal from a secondary radar. That's why it's called secondary radar, because it depends on the plane responding with speed, position, and other data. The transponder in the Boeing 777 is operated from the cockpit using this panel. The normal position would be this where the plane transmits all the information, while the transponder off would be this in standby. The theory of the bomb on board would have caused a total failure in the aircraft that would have caused all electrical systems to be lost suddenly, so the transponder would have turned off instantly. But 2 measurements were obtained in which the plane reported its position, but not its altitude. And that's exactly what this mode of the transponder does. So it seems that someone manually turned it off, scrolling the wheel through the other modes. This happened 64 seconds after the last radio communication. But additionally, several civilian and military ground radars detected an airplane, making a sudden turn to the left just at the moment when MH370 disappeared. These were primary radars, so they were able to detect the plane, even if it did not want to be detected. It's important to note that not all radars consistently detected the plane. However, by combining the data from all of them, it is known for certain that it was the MH370 and that it deviated from its initial trajectory by making a 180-degree turn. In addition, the investigation revealed that the 180-degree turn was so sharp that it was impossible for it to have been executed by the autopilot. This shows that whoever was in command knew exactly what they were doing. You see, it was no coincidence that the flight disappeared at that exact moment. It was an area where the airspaces of 4 different countries converge, so it was a point where there could be confusion in communications between controllers, as indeed happened. In addition, the chosen point to disappear was just between the airspace of Malaysia and Vietnam. And even the sharp 180-degree turn made sense. To the north, Thailand has a military air identification zone requiring any entering aircraft to identify itself. So that's why such a sharp turn was necessary. Apart from this, there's one more thing that happened when the plane came out of the turn. I'm going to simplify it as much as I can for understanding. The Boeing 777 is equipped with aircraft communications addressing and reporting system, a system that allows the plane to communicate with the airline to send documents, reports on its state, and similar information. The aircraft communications addressing and reporting system can communicate with ground stations thanks to radio antennas, but also thanks to satellite connection. The plane sends information to a satellite, which relays it to a ground station or vice versa. This satellite communication system is known as satellite communication. Well, thanks to the aircraft communications addressing and reporting system, the plane was sending a report every 30 minutes to the ground stations. The last of these reports was made 14 minutes before the aircraft turned off the transponder. That is, whoever took control of the plane also turned off the satellite communication. But turning off this system is not as simple as turning a little wheel. The aircraft communications addressing and reporting system is designed to emit an alert signal if it is manually turned off. This means that if it was deliberately deactivated from the ground, it could be detected that the shutdown had been intentional, and whoever was controlling the aircraft intended to simulate a total failure. So the system had to be shut down in another way, completely cutting off communication suddenly. This can be done from the cockpit by turning off the engine's electric generators, leaving the plane without power. If the aircraft detects that it is running out of electrical power, what it would do is automatically turn on the auxiliary power unit, a generator that is in the tail of the plane. But the auxiliary power unit can be manually turned off from the cockpit and in case the auxiliary power unit is turned off. The plane has a ram air turbine, a small turbine that sticks out and spins due to the speed of the air itself. This is done with the aim of generating electricity for the most essential systems. What if a plane's engine generators and the auxiliary power unit fail? Something extremely unlikely, of course, on this flight. They would have been manually shut off. And all this because the satellite communication, not being an essential system of the aircraft, did not receive electrical power with the ram air turbine, so now, officially, the plane had disappeared. After this, the satellite communication could be manually disabled from the cockpit, preventing any signal from being sent to the satellite even if power was restored. Remember this because it's important. But in a situation where the plane draws electrical power from the ram air turbine power would not be given to the autopilot because it is not an essential system, so the plane would have to be flown manually. Something consistent with the plane's traces on primary radars, as small corrections could be perceived. In reality, all of that is done from the cockpit in a matter of seconds. But I wanted to stop to explain it well because it is one of the key points of the MH370 mystery, as we will see later. It is believed that the person in command then incapacitated the passengers by depressurizing the plane to prevent them from attempting anything unusual. And that in reality was quite simple, as it would simply involve opening two valves that the plane has, one at the front and one at the back. These two valves are cockpit adjustable. At that precise moment, the masks would have automatically dropped, providing oxygen to each passenger for 22 minutes. But in the cockpit, there are two special masks that provide oxygen for many hours. Coincidentally, that same day, the maintenance staff had filled the oxygen for those masks. After the 22 minutes of oxygen provided by the masks to the passengers, at that altitude, a human being loses consciousness in approximately 1 minute. Shortly after, brain damage becomes irreversible, and if oxygen remains absent, death follows. Although this happens serenely and peacefully, gradually you see and feel less, noticing yourself slower than usual, and without realizing it, you've lost consciousness. While flying over Penang, the aircraft turned northwest and continued in a straight line. At that precise moment, a brief signal was detected from the co-pilot's mobile phone. This information is revealing, as in all the checklists that pilots follow before taking off, they include the order to put the mobile phone in airplane mode. So this would indicate that the co-pilot was really trying to make contact with the outside. However, the signal lasted only a few seconds and no communication was recorded. The telephone company confirmed that a brief signal was detected over Penang, confirming the primary radar information about the plane's deviation. Subsequently, the MH370 continued on that course, until it moved so far away from the primary radars that its trace disappeared, vanishing forever from any radar. At this point, it was clear that the plane had continued flying and had made many efforts to hide its position. So the entire scientific community turned out to try to find where the aircraft had gone. Many of these scientists had no knowledge of aeronautics, but were experts in other fields and wanted to contribute with their knowledge. Inmarsat was the communications company that owned the satellite the plane was using to operate. The satellite communication, which could have been sending information to the ground under normal conditions. As time went by, and after analyzing all the data from that day, Inmarsat stated that shortly after MH370 disappeared from the radars, something unexpected happened. The satellite received a connection request from the plane via the satellite communication system. This type of request was only generated when the system received electricity for the first time. That is, if someone had reconnected the plane's electrical generators. And that's why we know they had previously been turned off, but wait, why would they have turned them on? You'll see. In case the plane had been flying with the power of the ram, air turbine power would only have been supplied to the essential systems, as we have previously mentioned. So the fans that cool the entire avionics bay of the plane would have been turned off, and after flying for almost an hour. Under those conditions, it is highly likely that the plane's computers were overheating. If the temperature exceeded its limit, the plane would stop working. So whoever was in charge was probably forced to turn on the electric generators to cool the computers. With the satellite communication disconnected from the network and manually turned off, information could not be sent even if electric power returned. Well, that's what the person flying the plane thought. But it turns out that the Boeing 777 sent a request to the ground station when the electric current returned. An Inmarsat engineer had an idea. This request that the plane made came with the exact time it was sent. By comparing that exact time with the time the satellite received the signal, a small time lag could be seen. This lag indicated the time it took for the signal to travel from the plane to the satellite. Knowing that the signal moves at the speed of light, one could determine how far the plane was from the satellite. Actually, this is how any global positioning system works. Your mobile calculates its distance from a satellite based on the signal transmission time lag. The result is a circumference where the entire line is at the same distance from the satellite. You could be here, here, or here. To know the exact position, a global positioning system does this with several satellites, in such a way that the point where all the signals intersect is the position where you would be. The MH370 was only sending this signal to one satellite. So we know that an hour and 5 minutes after disappearing, the plane was on this circumference, not inside it, but on the line. In addition, just 3 minutes before it left the coverage of the primary radars, so it fits that the plane could be in this part of the arc. The ground station would try to establish communication with the aircraft every hour, so multiple arcs could be drawn where we know the plane was. That is, it could have made this trajectory, but it could also have made this other one, and so on, with infinite possibilities. But because of the type of signal, it is known for certain that the plane was flying and that it was over those arcs. For that reason, the aircraft search resources began to focus on that area of the Indian Ocean, but without getting results. In the end, there were a total of 7 arcs, and at the time the 8th was supposed to occur, the plane was no longer registered, so we know that it had already crashed there. In addition to the signals received by the satellite, the frequency could also be known, which allowed, thanks to the Doppler effect, to know if the plane was going up or down. This is due to the same effect as if you hear an ambulance siren. You know that in this part here it is approaching you, but in this part here you know that it is already moving away because you are hearing it. Different, depending on whether the object is moving towards you or away from you. Well, the same could be used to know if the plane was ascending towards the satellite or moving away from it, that is, descending. Are you starting to understand why this case is so fascinating? But wait, because the most incredible part is yet to come. Some erroneous frequency measurements were obtained in the first arc signal. This is very strange because we know that's what would happen to the transmitter if it had undergone large temperature variations. But to prevent this from happening, the plane has a subsystem that ensures the temperature does not fluctuate. But of course, if the person in charge had turned off the electrical generators, this system would not have received power from the small turbine from the moment the generators were turned off. So the fact that this signal had a wrong frequency reinforces the idea that the plane's electrical generators would have been turned off previously. Of all the arcs generated, the first and the last were login requests. The rest were the routine requests that the ground station made to the plane every hour. But why? The last one was a login request. We know that was the type of signal that was generated when the system first received electricity. In the first arc, this would have happened when the generators were restarted, but in the end, why? Well, looking at the time this happened, it would match up with the plane running out of fuel. I remind you that the plane left with a range of 7 hours and 31 minutes, and this happened 7 hours and 37 minutes after takeoff. So indeed, it seems that the plane had run out of fuel at that point, but when this plane runs out of fuel, it automatically turns on the auxiliary power unit, the tail generator. This generator is reserved a small amount of fuel so that even if the engines are lost, it can be powered. The hydraulic pumps that move the control surfaces of the plane to be able to handle the aircraft in a situation as critical as losing both engines. So when the engines shut down and the auxiliary power unit turns on, the electricity would have been briefly lost. So upon recovery, just like in the first arc, the satellite communication would send a logon request to the satellite. The internet is buzzing with various theories about the missing plane, ranging from the United States shooting it down to a black hole absorbing it, among other unlikely scenarios. From multiple independent sources among them, we know that the plane turned left at an angle of 180 degrees after passing the Igari point. In addition, we know that this turn was made manually, that it later followed this trajectory, and that it was later flying over these arcs. Of all the possible routes, it has been concluded that the plane had to turn south, and continue more or less on that course until it ran out of fuel. Since taking any other trajectory, the plane would have been detected by military radars from different countries. As we have explained so far, only someone who knew that model of plane very well could have done all of the above. And it just so happens that one of the people who knew the most about the Boeing 777 was on board that day. Commander Zahari, who was one of the most experienced pilots in that model, having flown more than 8,600 hours in it, the equivalent of a year of life flying inside that aircraft. And these would just be theories if it weren't for... Zahari demonstrated his flight simulator on his YouTube channel when his computers were registered. During the investigation, it was discovered that between February 2nd and 3rd, 2014, that is, just over a month before, he had been flying a route formed by these points created by him. And in the last 2 points, a fuel amount of 0 was entered, right in the area where MH370 would have run out of fuel. Many people say it was a coincidence and that he was simply practicing engine failures. as he was a person very interested in practicing procedures, and certainly his record confirms it. But what a coincidence that he was just practicing it on a route similar to the one that has been discovered the plane made? Mind you, I'm not accusing the commander, I'm just saying that all the evidence points to him. Contrary to all this, his family and friends said he was a charming person and showed no signs of evil. He also didn't leave a farewell note or anything similar for his children or wife, or at least there's no record of him having done so. Many experts find the communications before the transponder was turned off to be strange, which is why I've detailed it for you. First, when the commander reaches the requested altitude from the control tower, he confirms it by radio. But 6 minutes later, he communicates again by radio that he is still at that altitude. This second message is redundant and unnecessary. That's what the commander would have done if he had taken off his headphones, had been busy doing something else, and had left the radio unattended. If the control tower had asked him to change his altitude when he wasn't wearing his headphones at that moment, the control tower would have said, "No, do not change altitude." But it's also true that the second transmission could simply be because the commander wasn't sure if he had communicated or not that he had reached the desired altitude. In any case, it's clear that there's a big difference between the tone in which the commander makes the first transmission and the tone in which he makes the second one. Compare.
370 maintaining level 350. 370 maintaining level 350.
In the second transmission, it's as if the commander is more nervous or busier. Finally, they indicate to him by radio to communicate with Vietnam air traffic at a specified frequency. In that circumstance, the commander must repeat the frequency over the radio for both to ensure that he has understood the frequency well. Zahari does not repeat the frequency. But it is true that Zahari had been flying in that part of the world for many years, and he probably knew by heart what frequency it was. So actually, it's not that strange. In fact, in the official report of the MH370 investigation, it is. These communication anomalies before the transponder was turned off are strange, but not indicative of anything. But what is truly strange is that from the time the commander sends the last radio message until the transponder is turned off, there are 64 seconds. If a third person had taken control of the plane, they would have had to enter the cockpit, lift the pilots, take control of the plane, and turn off the transponder. All of that in less than 64 seconds. However, if one of the pilots had orchestrated all of this, he would simply have had to ask the other pilot to momentarily leave the cockpit. The cockpit can be closed from the inside for any reason or excuse. We know that the aircraft crashed because pieces have been recovered from both the outside and inside of the aircraft. Studies of wave behavior have been conducted on the east coast of Africa, and it makes sense that some pieces would have ended up there after a few years. The search for the aircraft and its remains ended in 2017. Since then, there have been independent groups of people conducting very professional investigations with the aim of finding the plane. In 2023, some scientists released a study of a new method to calculate the aircraft's trajectory. And you see if an electromagnetic wave has certain characteristics, but for a brief moment in time, its characteristics change. It's possible that the wave has been disturbed by the interference of an object that crosses its path, an object like an airplane. By reverse engineering all the electromagnetic signals from that day, a possible trajectory could be reconstructed. The interesting thing is that, independently, it complies with the plane moving northwest once it flew over Penang, although with a slight deviation. This could be because this technique was not very precise, or because the plane was already far away from the radars, and therefore these could have a failure. That is, perhaps this information could be more accurate than what we have from the radars. Then the aircraft would turn south, and as shown in this report, it was not traveling in a straight line. And the most interesting part comes at the end, when it had already dawned in that area of the planet. The aircraft reportedly flew in a figure 8 trajectory, which would confirm that the person who was controlling the aircraft was making sure there were no ships in the area. All this to be able to carry out his plan to make a plane disappear forever. As we have previously said, thanks to the Doppler effect of the radar signals from the arcs, it was possible to know if the plane was going up or down. In all the arcs, the altitude seemed to more or less remain constant. But in the last one of them, which would have been generated when the plane had lost power in both engines and the auxiliary power unit had turned on, it indicates that the plane was in a fall of 14,000 feet per minute. For reference, this is what a plane falling at that speed looks like from the outside. This is consistent with having lost power from both engines and falling into the sea uncontrollably. In this 2023 study, a new impact zone is suggested to reactivate the search for the aircraft. Surprisingly, in 2024, an American company contacted the Malaysian government to offer to search for the plane under a no-fine, no-fee contract. If they don't find anything after so many years, it's difficult to find any valuable evidence, even when analyzing the exact impact area. The sea is constantly moving and a lot of time has passed. But even if they find the black boxes, it's possible that the person who carried this out could have cut off the data and voice recordings from the cockpit. I hope this video has clarified the complexity of the MH370 case for you.